Knowledge, specifically foreknowledge, can either be a gift or a curse. Oftentimes, when dealing with issues that you would like to avoid or mitigate, it's a gift. You use the foresight to plan, to prepare, to assess and counteract a problem before it comes to head. But there are other times when foreknowledge is detrimental. When knowing the future, to even the slightest degree, can be disastrous, terrifying. Ignorance isn't always bliss, but sometimes it's better for you, if sanity is something you care about maintaining. I found this out when I got a peek at the future of 2021. I work at a coffee shop. It's nothing special, just your ordinary cafe staffed by dreary-faced millennials just trying to make a few bucks to fund college, or to simply get by in an increasingly harrowing economy. I get along fine with my coworkers, that is to say, we don't actively hate each other, but we aren't friends either. We each have our own lives, our own sensibilities, our own perspectives on the world and those in it. I explain all this because if circumstances had been different, if my coworkers and I had actually held disdain for each other, or were entirely unsociable, I might have never read the contents of that awful book. I might have been spared the horrific prescience imparted by it. I was sweeping the floor at the end of the day, my normal closing duty, when I saw a piece of trash stuck beneath one of the table legs near the front of the cafe. It was lodged beneath the back leg, so I had to stoop down and pry it free. While down there, I happened to spot another object half hidden beneath a projection on the wall, in which a heating unit is housed. It took considerable exertion. I've stretched maybe twice since graduating high school 4 years ago, before I finally reached it. I pulled it free and slowly straightened up, my back already aching from the prolonged uncomfortable positioning. I sat in a chair and put the object on the table. It was a book covered in dust and crumbs. It was old, very old, and bound in a thick red leather. The title was unreadable, having been faded by time, or irreparably marred by dust and grime. I knew that a nearby bookstore had closed down recently, although I had first doubted that the book could have come from that store. It seemed aged beyond anything a relatively modern bookshop might sell. And yet I couldn't remember seeing anyone reading such a peculiar book in the 4 months that I had worked at the cafe. My coworkers were busy cleaning the machines, listening to music and generally paying no attention to me. I was free to go once I had swept and mopped, and I rarely said any goodbyes before leaving. Confident that a brief break in my duties would not be noticed, I wiped the dust and crumbs from the book and opened it. The words were illegible and doubly startling. They had clearly been handwritten, and yet the writing was so stylized, so consistently immaculate, that I was actually mesmerized by the unique and impeccable penmanship. And despite being entirely incapable of understanding the words, I flipped through the pages, amazed at how the words flowed with a peculiar rhythm, and seemed to contain great meaning. A message of a deep thought that I suspected would still puzzle me even if I were able to read it. I must have lost track of time, being so absorbed in the mysterious book, because I was suddenly startled by the question, "What are you reading?" My 3 coworkers stood in front of me, with expressions of confusion or amusement. I had never read in the shop before, so it was probably a weird sight, seeing me so engrossed by a book. I explained how I had found it, and turned the book around so they could see the beautiful, though indecipherable words. Each in turn made a guess at the language of origin, with Latin, Greek, and even Spanish being suggested. And clearly, as you'll soon come to know, none of us are scholars. And yet even with my monolingual basicness, I was sure that none of the words were of a language that I had ever seen before. I said as much, and my coworkers begrudgingly agreed after scanning the pages. I saw the excitement grow in their eyes as they pored over the sentences, which were separated crisply, perfectly, despite the absence of pre-established page lines. Without asking them to, and actually happy that they had done so, they each pulled up a chair to the table to sit around the enigmatic book. I laid it as flat as the ancient binding would allow, and turned it so that it faced them. Sheila, my immediate supervisor and key holder of the cafe, flipped through the pages and then passed it to Derek, who did the same. Ashton followed their movements but did not take the book herself. Despite her obvious fascination, her germophobic tendencies still prevailed, and she refused to touch something that had been on the floor and covered in debris for who knows how long. When everyone had thoroughly examined the book, I pulled it back in front of me, feeling somewhat responsible for, if not oddly attached to, the arcane tome. We all agreed that nothing could be gleaned from the writing. I got on my phone but realized the futility in trying to manually translate the words into English. None of the bizarre characters were present on my phone's keyboard. I searched through my app store and found an app that lets you upload a picture of text for instant translation. But a few minutes later, I uninstalled the app after it had failed to provide any direct or related translation for the strangely written words. Momentarily stumped, I Googled the book's general description, but nothing came up that seemed appropriately applicable for that particular text. Ashton, still avoiding direct contact with it, pointed out that the book's story, if it were a narrative, seemed incomplete. The basis of this observation being that the same format of writing present throughout spanned even the entirety of the last page. It was as if the author had desperately needed to provide as much information as possible, leaving no space for any supplemental acknowledgments, publication details, or afterword. Derek, the most rationally minded, or perhaps the least imaginative of us, suggested that maybe there was nothing to be learned, that maybe it was a nonsensical diary of some mentally deranged person. It being left in the shop, forgotten and not once asked about, as far as any of us could remember, seemed to support this argument, as we assumed that a mentally unhinged person might not care about the loss of one volume of a series of manic ramblings. I would have agreed if the writing hadn't been so stylish, and if the language in which it was written hadn't seemed so authentic. The lettering was consistent throughout the book. There wasn't a randomness to the character choices, as you might think to find in a book written by someone not altogether mentally. There was a definite, ordered language present, and although I couldn't understand it, its linguistic consistency seemed to be carried along from the first page to the last. And still, the book's apparent age gave suggestions of scholarly value. It didn't seem like the property of the kind of person, insane or not, who might venture into a second-rate cafe for cheap coffee and cookies. Derek, after listening to my reasoning, eventually agreed, and the others nodded along. 10 minutes had passed since we had all convened to study it, and yet nothing about the book's language had been ascertained. Finally, after scooting together so that we could all see it at once, we decided to try and dumbly guess at possible meanings of words. I knew, and I think the others knew as well, that it was logically pointless, that without context or a key, nothing could be translated into our language. But there was a certain vague desire, a palpable impulse, that arose within me, and presumably the others, to work towards gaining some knowledge about the book and its contents. All huddled together, I reopened the book before us, and when 8 eyes simultaneously peered at the first page, something truly profound happened. We understood the words. It was unlike anything that I had ever seen or heard about before. The moment that our sights touched the page, we were each captivated, enchanted by the bewitching inscriptions, which were translated instantly as our shock-widened eyes moved from word to word. Our minds too had in some effable way been linked, as we kept a single, measured pace. For a while, none of us spoke, and the words were silently, hungrily read. The pages speedily turned, though I could not say with certainty who it was that performed the latter action. 8 eyes danced across those crimson inked leaves. 4 brains comprehended the terribly awesome meanings and the darker suggestions and implications beyond and beneath. Before any of us had thought to take a break from reading, we had arrived at the middle of the book. It wasn't until Sheila cried out in horror that the trance was partially broken. Ashton tore her gaze away, though Derek and I kept our eyes glued to the pages, only slightly expanding our awareness to include the words of our coworkers. Hearing Sheila's voice, though not looking at her, I listened as she said that she couldn't go on, that the things that we had read about were already so awful, so existentially dreadful, that she couldn't bear to read anymore. Ashton commiserated with her, expressing similar feelings. But even through my half-awareness of the conversation, I heard the intonation of curiosity in Ashton's voice. She wanted to continue on. Derek and I had gone on ahead, though our pace had been slowed considerably, and the images that had been seen earlier, the feelings felt, were entirely absent in the newly read pages when seen by only 4 eyes. It seemed that without Ashton and Sheila's accompaniment, the book could only be partially read, the words legible, but the meanings behind them dim or obfuscated. With greater effort, I tore my gaze away, and Derek sighed, almost in disappointment. Without a partner, the words had become unreadable to him. We all looked at each other, at last understanding how the book was meant to be read. It required at least 2 people for the words to transform into readable text, 3 for a general meaning, and 4 people reading altogether could read and fully fathom the blackly apocalyptic information therein. Wordlessly, Sheila calmed down, and Ashton put an arm around her. Surprising us all, Ashton then used her other hand to turn the still dirty book slightly towards her. Her eyes were aglow with hunger for knowledge, a deep desire to learn all that could be learned from the tome. I realized in that moment that none of us doubted the validity of the information. We were all certain that things we had read would come to pass, that the preternaturally deciphered book detailed events in humanity's near future. All in agreement, we again joined together in studying the pages. Finishing the book and peeling my eyes away was like gradually coming out of a drunken stupor. I felt mentally exhausted, emotionally drained, as if I had personally experienced the lives of countless entities, and my spirit was afterwards thrown back into my own body. In a way, that is kind of what happened. The book read almost as a historical report. It detailed events in a manner suggesting that they had already happened, and reflected with a bleak hindsight on how they might have been avoided. Several people's perspectives were related with great detail, some having been darkly influential in the coming events, others merely grief-stricken or disheartened observers, bystanders to horrors and atrocities that none of us would have ever imagined occurring. Sheila, deeply disturbed by what we had read, rose from her seat with some difficulty and stumbled towards the exit, tossing the store's keys onto a table before going out. Ashton looked to Derek and then to me, with eyes of deep regret, and then got up and left as well, either to join Sheila or go home herself. Derek and I stared at the table for a while, neither looking directly at the book, but thinking about it all the same. Finally, Derek spoke up saying, "We have to tell someone." I was somewhat thankful that Ashton had gone, because despite her earlier curiosity, I knew she would have staunchly argued against such an idea. Her personal hypochondriac sensibilities sometimes extended generally to topics of public safety and precaution as well. And I know that she would demand the book be hidden away, or destroyed, so that no one else could read its abysmal, soul-crushing contents. But the things that we had read, the events that it said will occur in just this year, are too terrible to withhold from humanity. Widespread ignorance of this magnitude would lead to destruction. The events would happen just as they had been written. So Derek and I decided to compromise. I am going to provide a single page from the book, which is sufficiently predictive, sufficiently terrifying, to encompass the greater message of the future historical account. We read this together, memorized it even, as the images appeared faint and ephemeral in our minds, and then burned the book in the oven. Here is the page. It was through mankind's own inquisitiveness that the disincarnate were made real, and their transcendental horrors given substance upon the earth. Humanity, ever hungry to understand itself, to unravel and solve the question of existence, finally found its answer. Their philosophers and scientists had worked tirelessly to solve that ultimate question, and the answer destroyed them. In the year 2021, the month is not given, shadows upon shadows fell upon the earth, compounding, congealing, growing molten and caustic. Men drowned and boiled in the darkness given form. Their bodies grew fat and burst, and these corpse-born nightmares flourished, having feasted upon the indwelling light that existed within even the most black-hearted of men. They poured from the bloated and melted forms, tread the surface of the planet, and annihilated the inhabitants, scourged these species relentlessly, mercilessly. Mankind, since it could form and dictate its own thoughts, had asked itself, what am I? How can I be? Awareness blossomed into intelligence, intelligence into sapience. Through it all, the guiding impetus, sentience, the capacity to wonder at its own existence, to differentiate itself amidst its environment, was a quality that had been unique to mankind. A quality other entities sought, or to be more accurate, were compatible with. Life elsewhere was mechanical, unthinking. It operated mindlessly, survived and propagated as nature dictated. Only man somehow had been instilled or evolved with the unknowingly coveted ability to imagine, to conceptualize, to dream. When the answer for how this came to be was uncovered, the revealed knowledge was not limited to mankind. Other entities were automatically drawn to it, as they would be to water or food. And darkness arrived first. Darkness, shadows, things which had never seen light and had thrived in the abysms between stars. Intelligent darkness, but lacking sentience. Biological machines, but when given the capacity for consideration, for analytical thought, darkness changed. A sentient darkness is an inimical darkness. Light, the thing which had since darkness's conception been unfamiliar, was now known to it, and it yearned for the light. And within what species did light naturally dwell? Humanity. So, upon peeking over the shoulders of mankind's scholars and seeing that revelatory truth, darkness viewed humanity as its enemy, unworthy of the light's gifts, and laid siege to the planet and its people. A cataclysmic encroachment of corporeal shadows brought humanity to its knees, and its own unwillingness to work together, to set aside its petty differences and stand as one against the great cosmic terror, is what led to its ultimate extinction. The knowledge of man's origins would have always been uncovered. That was unpreventable. Humanity could only distract itself with technology and theatricality for so long. Eventually, the yearning to know the truth of itself emerged again, more powerful than before. What the answer was, this record cannot say. The truth, not only of human creation, but its purpose as well, has been lost forever, buried among the ashes of the civilization that discovered it. But mankind, if it had merely looked beyond its sphere and seen the darkness peeking in, could have prevented, or at least forestalled, its destruction.